Okay, so welcome everyone to technically our third session. And as I mentioned, I'd like to, now that we're even smaller, this is nice because we can, really try to get to know each other a little bit and understand each other's perspectives and how do we kind of co-facilitate with each other so we can try to enrich each other's projects. So we can think about that for even today or maybe the next session. Or we can continue the practice of me isolating a couple of paragraphs and trying to do some framing and introductory remarks. I do have a little bit of a detour through Kant that I was thinking of because it's invoked in the Derrida chapter, because some questions came up about Kant and Husserl, which I think are critical. Um, but ideally, in our session, we have to look at the Derrida chapter that we wanted to, and then the section 3 of Being in Time, which is only 3 pages, but there's a lot to be compared and contrasted with the Derrida text. And it's kind of uncanny, maybe in the spirit of Derrida's method. Because we used to wonder, you'd have all these texts at the beginning of a lecture set or session. You're wondering, okay, is he gonna say why they're connected? Why did we read these together at the same time? He never did that. It just somehow the connections and the parallels will either magically occur in the moment, not because of him. It's just like we're all looking at it like, oh wow, Heidegger is talking about the crisis in the sciences here, and Derrida's work is on Husserl's crisis in the sciences and origin. What is that planned? I can tell you it wasn't planned, but I was so thrilled when I saw, oh, section 3 is giving us a little bit of that being in time and using the word crisis in the sciences, which is interesting. And then, Derrida speaking about, as we see in this chapter, a little bit more about history. So if it's okay, could we do a little bit of framing first and then go into the text? Would that be okay? Want to be mindful of time. Do we have about an hour and a half today or 2 hours, roughly speaking? If people have to leave, of course, they can do that, but we can try to go as long as we can. So, not to start backwards, but if those that might be familiar with the later Derrida, by that I mean from this standpoint in 1962, the late 80s and early 90s, 1989, the pivotal moment at the end of the Cold War, and the works that came out just after, and I'm thinking particularly about The Gift of Death, Dalai Lama. And there's a famous phrase where he's drawing from John Patočka, who's a Czech philosopher of history right after the Cold War, a very kind of iconic figure that draws a lot of compassion for French intellectuals. In contrast to what's happening here in the US with Fukuyama and the end of history thesis that, okay, communism is dead, the US won, this is it, history is not going to progress beyond this, capitalism, democracy, individual rights, secularism, stable institutions, technology as far as they knew it back then. That's it. The rest of you can just catch up to that. That's the end of history. Not to simplify it. And Derrida, again, in another brilliant way, opens up the aporia saying, wow, bringing a kind of spatializing history that way with an end presupposes some kind of eternal conception of even like an end, like the idea of eschatology, except it's a secularized form, unlike Christian eschatology. And it's an endless end. So, this is not an end and then a new beginning or the end of everything and that's it. But it's the presumption that there could be this teleological consummation, which is even hard to find in Hegel because people might think that, but it's not that simple in Hegel. But for Fukuyama, he simplifies it. And he goes, to bring in the end of history is actually to violate the sacred idea of the finitude of historicity itself, and what it means to be truly finite and open, transcendent, going back to Heidegger. And not to assume that within history we have that arrogance to think, oh, well, we're here, we can stop and say, okay, this is what ended. So it was awesome to see that type of critique so early on, like he always did, to look at his moment and see what was kind of truly pathological, perhaps authoritarian, like we're living through today. Um, that's about the end discussion. Here we are talking about the origin, and in this, the origin of the sciences. And it'll be interesting how do we get into the critiques here that are being made? His profound early signs and signals of what will then become more explicit, if I will, definitions of the tropes of deconstruction, the themes of deconstruction, the trace, the architrace, the supplement, um, speech and writing, early on at least in the 60s, the phallocentric, logocentric constitution metaphysics, the Eurocentric structure of it, the presumption of presence and self-same presence, the specious unity that we have to believe in between the relationships between signs, going back to Saussure, sign signifier. Whatever he took from the extremely iconoclastic models that Lacan was creating, Levi-Strauss too, who he spends a lot of time with. So all these other figures come into play, but the full-blown deconstruction comes a little bit later. Here, to talk about it, it's so nice to go back to this because he's talking about phenomenology, of course, and history, and that these kind of fine distinctions between a phenomenological reduction of empirical history. And again, just to come back to a little bit of Husserl, reduction is, as you know, suspension. Epoche in the Greek is a suspendedness as time, but bracketed in a way because you don't want to simply demarcate the here and now from a no longer or not yet. Heidegger picks up on this. Difference too, that's its event of differentiation and delay, the spatialization of it. So, it's not an event of that occurring that you could say right now is happening. It's a more uncanny sense of time that Derrida is going for. But the bracketing in Husserl is like it's going to drive you crazy, but you just if you're going to get to that essential description of the essential flux of your experience, not just subjectively as this mind and body. I'm in my home office here. There's some kind of external thing outside my eyes, my door, some clothes on the floor, kind of factual description of this internal versus external, or whatever one imagines happening inside. You want to suspend all that. You want to keep it open and to use some Heideggerian language, see what the pre-comprehension is in your experience of those things occurring as such. We'll get into that later, but it's one thing to do that in your own office, wherever you are right now. But to try to do that with an origin in history of something that does come into existence, and when it does, it is factually, empirically, an eternal truth. This is why I'm curious about mathematics. And it's repeatable because you can teach any kid how to you don't need to be the first geometer, as they say. Kant thinks is some great genius, some happy man with a happy thought that occurred to him. And we'll come back to Kant because it's not that simple in Kant, I think, what Derrida says. But anyway, point is we're not talking about the phenomenological breakthrough for that first geometer that had that great insight to then come up with something like, at least in the West, the first principles of geometry, which of course we know is necessary for mathematics. And with Galileo, it becomes mathematized science. Newton, you need math to do science, blah, 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 the Western modern structure initially, out of the world. And then, of course, philosophy is logic, if it has that verisimilitude to the sciences, which I don't know, simplified the analytic tradition, as you know, in the Anglo-American world, but I like to see themselves in relationship to not the scientific method, but the kind of precise, kind of clarification of thought that's required through logical distillations and propositions and the structure of them, as if they're talking about mathematical structures, but they're talking about ideas and thoughts. Russell and Wittgenstein. And of course, they complicate it. That's not what I want to do. I don't want to do injustice to them. So now we're going to have to deal with this deconstruction of the origin. And that's where it kind of is. If you take the end of history problem, okay, the end of history brings in a violation of finitude. Along the way, simplistic accounts, self-serving accounts of the genius of the West. For Kant, the kind of strange meanderings of perhaps the Indians and the Egyptians and the Babylonians. Those guys are prehistory for Hegel. Real history that becomes reflective and empirical is the Greek Romans up to the British. And of course, the next stage, speculative, will outframe that into what he wants, which is his post-Lutheran German idealist absolute statement of freedom was the end of history. It's a process and ends of history. But yeah, so to deconstruct the origin, and I think the way we want to get into it, when we think about reduction, I'm going to start sharing here so we can look at that last few paragraphs. Unfortunately, we can't. I'd love to see. Let's see if this is it. It'd be amazing if we can go through the, maybe in our discussion we can do that. Go through the earlier parts of this chapter two, but I'm going to kind of quickly come down to um, the last few paragraphs of this chapter, where he again quotes Husserl on his main undertaking. And right here, people can see this. And prior to that, he was talking about this erste Maligkeit, the first time occurrence. So this may be crude and it may be inaccurate. But the summary of the prior section is we can lay out the Emporio paradox. This geometric structure came into existence, went out 2,000 years later. And if we go through any kind of normal level of schooling and we're able to do it, all of us can eventually get some, like we had to do in high school, some version of the geometry introductory to reduction to geometry. We don't need to be the person prior to the origin or the event of that occurring for the first time, because we receive it. It's kind of ready made, and I can go through the steps and get that feeling like you did as a kid, like, oh wow, I did the proof of the theorem. I did the deductions and I laid it out, and I'm right. Oh yeah, the teacher said I got all the steps correct, and wow, how did I do that? That's great. And you feel good. You feel like, okay, wow, this is interesting. So where did that sense and ability be fashioned if we're on this side of the quote unquote origin? And the job is to reduce this, the essential structure of what we are already ready made in our subjectivities, suspended, and then try to get at the question of not what was built up inductively prior to that event for that first younger to see what the rudimentary elements were to get them on the path to the intuition. Kant in the first critique makes this distinction too, that fine art is something else because you can't apply the event of Newton, you know, as amazing and as great and as revolutionary, as unthinkable and as like godlike level achievement that Newton did in his time, a guy sitting there in the 1600s, sitting on the shoulders of giants. The trick about science is that once it happens, it's teachable. You know, you can do this. We can all be taught some way or another to go through those steps to get to that point, to understand how the laws of motion were articulated. That's what we learn as kids. And all the way, if you want to keep doing that, become future scientists and mathematicians, that's what you do. That's not the project kid. It's almost like going around the back of an origin that you want to suspend because you want to question, deconstruct. And how is it that we're even able to have this fundamental commitment? We talked about the word responsibility to the protection of this heritage that is supposed to be self-contained and appears transcendentally sound. It doesn't need any empirical validation. It doesn't mean you to tell you it's true. It just is. So this is all kind of foreshadowing what we have to do. So I guess the aporia is you have to say there's an origin. It created this. We're suspending this, including the origin. What's the arche before that? Before that seems like a temporal presupposition, as if it's like, okay, here's the origin. Not to laugh at the physicists, but it's funny to me when they come around to saying again, having not read Kant's dialectic and the cosmological antinomies, oh, the origin, the universe doesn't have a big bang. Oh no, it was the death of another one, and now it's the beginning of another one. And, yeah. It's just like, okay, good. What about Eastern traditions who've said this thousands of years ago? What do you, good, thank you. Okay. The antinomies are so simplistic, but not being derogatory. That's the reality that everyone is subscribed to because they're the dictators of what, kind of authoritarian sense of what physical reality is at the level of space, time, in the universe. And they have the power. But I'm just saying, what Derrida wants to say about Kant and Husserl, we can say even today, like, okay, physicists think they can just now deconstruct the idea of the origin of our physical universe. Okay, let's look at this I think we're going to get into, especially so that we can move to the section 3 in being and time, take a little detour through Kant. Let's look at what this Husserl quote is, and then Derrida here, these last few paragraphs that ends chapter 2 here, the the zigzag movement that he speaks about. And if you remember the back and forth relatedness to get around the hermeneutic circle, you need a Dasein to shape the question of the meaning of being. You got to presuppose that. Well, if you're going to presuppose it, you better talk about that Dasein. But are we not going in a circle of saying in order to pose the question of the meaning of being, we already have this answer? Remember that in that section? And now I'm going to take this whole book called Being and Time, not to answer the question of the meaning of being, because he couldn't, Heidegger, but I'm going to do this analytic on Dasein. We get all these great things about Dasein that fructify all these great ideas in the 20th century for common philosophy. But I don't get to answer that question I posed about the meaning of being. A circle problem. But no, it's a back and forth relatedness. Time is the horizon of understanding being. Is time the horizon for being? Are we trying to get to time itself? I said, we could. But then Dasein, the meaning of Dasein's being, care, death, resolve, moment of vision. What was he saying in the very beginning? The meaning of Dasein's being is temporality. Oh, time is the horizon of understanding being. Meaning of being of Dasein's being is temporality. Time, temporality. He never could finish that. He tried from 27 onwards, and then, you know, rest was history, as they say. But also in that section too, we're going to see all these fine distinctions between history and historical time. We'll get to that. But let's get to Derrida first. So here's Derrida at 62, Heidegger 27, and yet what the heck is going on here? Husserl is in the middle. Later Husserl, sorry. Under these conditions, Husserl can write our interest shall be the inquiry back to the most original sense. Remember, sense meaning even Bedeutung for Heidegger, meaning not semantic, but sense, but not senses as in the empirical senses. To make sense, understand. And therefore it means something to me as useful. Not in a practical way, but as a kind of authentic way. The most original sense in which geometry once arose was present as a tradition of millennia, thousands of years. We inquire into that sense in which it appeared in history for the first time, in which it must have appeared, even though we know nothing of the first creators and are not even asking after them. So this is not a story about genius and valorizing them, and like, oh wow, God, those guys are lucky and they get to be remembered by history and we valorize them. We still do. Go see a biographical video on Newton. It's, it's cool. He did some bad things, kind of like a mean guy at the end of his life, but you know, he was Newton, not the other guy in the other dorm room in Cambridge. He came up with the modern age. John Locke, in the beginning, God said, "Let there be light," and there was Newton. I mean, you get someone saying that about you. What is that? We're not doing that type of valorization here. Something else. So here's now Derrida, kind of respond quote. We'll look at these paragraphs because it gives us a lot, kind of building blocks for deconstruction. Here, in which it must have appeared, clearly reveals Husserl's intention and sums up the sense of every reduction. Already deconstruction's at work. He may not be articulating or defining deconstruction yet, but questioning this, he's going to question within history, the must have appeared, what is this appearance, the dream that this could appear, that you could pull this off, Husserl. Hey, you really want to figure this out and you're going to solve this? Heidegger, you're really going to answer the question of meaning of being? Deconstruction has to reorient us to how we even have this compulsion to be in the situation that Husserl and Heidegger are in. Naivete, to think that you can be in that question and even try to answer it. So the must have appeared marks the necessity now recognized and timelessly assigned to a past fact and an eidetic prescription and of an a priori norm. So I can state this value of necessity independently of all factual cognition. Here we go. I don't want to spend too much time with that. I know that's not being unpacked here, but let's keep moving and we'll come back to it. Moreover, this is a double necessity. It is that of a quod and a quomodo, the necessity of having had a historical origin, of having had such an origin, in such a sense of an origin. Look at the triplicity there. There's the must, there's the necessity for the Husserlian project that is a transcendental phenomenology of history, if you will. Not intellectual history, the history of great people discovering great things. Having had an historical origin, having had such an origin, and then even a sense of the origin. Wow. Later Derrida, non-origin of the origin, other than the origin, you know, the non-originality of the origin, two before one, the critique of the self-same presence of origin. Not just the fixity of that, which is the aporia of time from Aristotle to Heidegger and then Derrida's critique of that. This valorization of the origin, but an irreducible historicity is recognized in that this must is announced only after the fact of the event. So the event occurs, geometry is invented, it exists, we all learn it, you can't throw it away. It's like energy, you can't destroy it, you just kind of distribute it. It's permanent, the mathematical truth. I can tear down this building. Trump can tear down the world. But this is the eternal structure. I cannot define the necessary sense and necessity of the origin before geometry was in fact known and before it had in fact been given to me, absolutely free with respect to what it governs. The lawfulness of sense is nothing in itself. Radical suspension, radical reduction in a Derridean deconstructive sense compared to the Husserlian phenomenology is questioning the Husserlian project. Like, you're saying geometrical truths, once they come to existence, are transmitted and they're preserved and are indisputable once they come to be, as opposed to we humans, we come into being and we die. But this project of trying to understand the origin of the sense of this, not the empirical rise of it or the psychological makeup of the individual creator, but the possibility of this even arising, and to understand that, to think that you could do that, what's presupposed here? Also, the second, whatever in fact the first producer discovered geometrical idealities were, it is an a priori necessity that they followed from some sort of non-geometry. Remember that material ontology? Writing and inscription, scribbling, text, perception, the first sense. Derrida has great insight. Give credit to him. We have to have that speech writing hierarchy in order to not have a different history of our relationship to that, where writing is not subservient, or we don't even think what writing is. It's the dead copy of living speech. He'll get to this later, the postcard. So his revolution in terms of rethinking even that comes later, of course. But the a priori necessity that followed from some sort of non-geometry that sprang from the soil of a pre-geometrical experience. So to think you can get back to that when we're on the other side is a strange thing. There's an infinite distance, let's say, between the pre-geometrical experience, the logical assumption that you need that in order for geometry to occur, us sitting here thinking we can go back to that, and that being impossible because then we're back to that ridiculous empirical history. Sorry, what simple tales are about, well, this is how, Euclid got this from Egypt and that from there, put it together, and he was a happy guy and came about. Now, this is the aporia. A phenomenology of the experience is possible thanks to a reduction, and here we go, appropriate desedimentation, destruction in Heidegger of the history of ontology to reframe that question, deconstruction, which we'll get many different, I'm sure, conversations going, but that is. But here we get at least a loosening up in the calcified, fossilized things there. Where on this side, we're looking at it and we want to say, oh, yeah, there's an origin to that. The dead dinosaur might have looked like this before we see the fossil. No, it's a living kind of archive, so to speak, living and dead. But there's a spectral thing happening here. Something not paranormal, but if I can use that as a metaphor for the most profound questions that philosophy can raise. Third and finally, whoever in fact the first geometers were, which neither Derrida or Husserl care about, Kant in the early quote apparently does. Whatever, in fact, the empirical content of their acts was, as if we can write that history, it's a priori necessary that the establishing gestures had a sense such that geometry issued from them with the sense as we know it, as we now know it. So here's us, they're forming the sense. We all have that, like we kind of share the same DNA as a Homo sapien. Michael, your DNA isn't different from mine. That's remarkable. Two totally different human beings. But no, the sense wasn't just born with the origin. And the sense of the origin, which Husserl wants, wasn't also co-present. For, of course, the reactivating reduction supposes the iterative reduction of the static instructional analysis, which teaches us once and for all what the geometrical phenomenon is and what its possibility is constituted. I guess if we can't, there's the equation for the Pythagorean, for example. And someone may want to tell us, some historian of science may want to tell us, well, this is how Pythagoras actually came up with this. Or for that matter, Einstein's, E equals to mc squared. So many different elements had to go into that. I don't know if we produced a complicated history. But he got it. He's the great guy. Stands forever until someone else does something else. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about the surprise, if you will, the uncanny surprise that the sense was even formed. If you can start there, the facticity of the fact of a geometrical truth, the facticity of that, as we talked about, is being thrown into this history that's been received. That if we truly respect our own finitude as a form of freedom and transcendence from this enslavement, this is back to Nietzsche, we should be able to question why we even have this relationship to this kind of eternal structure. Because we can question that eternal structure. Think about all the other type of metaphysical structures that purport eternal systems. This is in the name of our own freedom and, quite frankly, our own responsibility to question that. This means by necessity, which is no less than an accidental and exterior fate, that I must start with the ready-made geometry, such as it is now in circulation, like what kids learn, and which I can always phenomenologically read in order to go back through it and question the sense of the origin. That's what this is all about. Thus, both thanks to and despite the sedimentations, I can restore history to its traditional diaphaneity. That's the word. Let's try to get into that. If someone can help me with that, that'd be fine. I have some sense. Husserl here speaks of, here we go, the Rückfrage. And this becomes return question, but he's going to do something else in French. A notion no doubt current enough, but now takes on a sharp and precise sense. We've translated by return inquiry, that's the English of his French, question en retour, like its German synonym, return inquiry and question en retour as well is marked by the postcard comes later, epistolary reference or resonance of a communication from a distance. Those of you that do daily religious work, Paul's letter is arriving. That's a complicated matter for New Testament and biblical theology and history. I know, but this question of what is a return to? It's not a return to a static moment in history. It's an occurrence or happening itself. The return is itself a type of his relationship between something that's not quite original and ready-made. We want to desedimentize that a bit, but then something's also coming to us. I guess the analogy is when, the light that finally showed up here is from a star that's 8 billion years. It took 8 billion years for that star to get its light over to us, and now we're seeing it now, kind of thing. It's not that. That's the spatialization. This is nothing spatial. Like Rückfrage, return inquiry is asked on the basis of a first posting from a received and already readable document. The possibilities offered me of asking again and in return about the primordial and final attention of what has been given me by the tradition. I guess the analogy is I don't get to see the person who wrote the letter. The letter comes in the mail. I read it. I got to reimagine them. They're not here for me to asked him, hey, what do you mean by that? I can feel good about it. I can make them come alive in the words as if they're there telling me something. Um, but maybe another analogy is you discover a letter that you never received. It was buried. The person didn't send it to you. Your friend, they died. You're going through people are trying to go through their things to see what they can remember and collect in memory of them. Oh, here's a letter that was never sent. That gets into some temporal porias for some Derrida later. But the point is to question, this notion of a final intention. The latter, which is only immediacy itself and openness to a telecommunication in general, as Husserl says, open to continued inquiry. So here we go. This is the repetition part. And I'll close here before I open it to Heidegger. These analogies, the metaphorical focus of our text, confirm at what point is required the zigzag way of proceeding. Erasure for Derrida is the return movement, not to an origin that got us to this point, my ready-made subjectivity. I'm going to believe naively in whatever I'm thinking about the origin of something, whatever it happens to be. It can be anything. And I'm really excited about that because I really like that thing. I like geometry. I want to know, how did it come about? No, that's not it. It's the presense that's being received, but not in a linear way because it's not crossing in some kind of accumulation of history. And I'm struck because I do have this relationship and I have to constantly iterate back and forth between my own intuitions, checking them about the very thing I'm posing as a question, while that question is kind of possessing me because it's compelling me to think and talk about it. I know that sounds kind of wild and abstract, but it's a way to try to get into the aporia a bit, because don't think of something rectilinear. Confirm at what point it is required the zigzag way of proceeding, so deconstructionist method or procedure, which will appear later. A procedure that the crisis proposes as a sort of necessary circle in which is the only pure form of every historical experience. Now, again, we're going to go to Heidegger pretty quickly here. Not Dilthey's subject and object of history. How can I be the subject of history? History is usually written by human beings. The historian is a subject currently living now. I'm going to make that history my object. So I'm being made by the thing that I'm trying to conceptualize and represent. In Heidegger, you're going to see 5 different senses appear beyond, being just a subject or object of history or being within history. This is derived from something in the primordial. Return inquiry, the reactionary and therefore revolutionary moment of this interplay, not the revolutionary event occurring in history, which is the origin of geometry. But the revolutionary moment of this interplay would be impracticable if geometry were essentially something which continually circulated as a common coin in validity of ideality. This is interesting. Be interesting to get your perspectives. No more than the history of its transmission grounds the value of gold. Marx goes to a lot of pains to deconstruct this as the standard. How did it come about as a sense of its value, not just the fact that it's rare? But once it's there, it's the standard. Can any worldly history give the sense of this circulation as a common coin? Common coin meaning it's in circulation. It's already there. Don't question when it started. Smith's invisible hands already work. We live in it. Be happy. Get more of it if you want to be rich. If you don't care about the poor, like our current system today, then don't even question the circulation or the fact that the coin has significance. That's what's used. That's what's accumulated. That's it. If you can't make it, too bad. But this is what we can take as a revolutionary take on even questioning the commonality. The maintenance of this circulation permits the neutralization of worldly history. Neutralization then opens the space for an intentional and intrinsic history. It's really the historicity of this economic history and circulation that permits the comprehension of how a tradition of truth is possible in general. How do you even make a tradition so it maintains itself? And why? I thought the revolutionary act is to question the tradition. Short, what seems to be of utmost importance to Husserl as much in operation, reactivation itself as the ability to open a hidden historical field as the nature of the field itself as the possibility of something like a reactivation. So I guess you can say here, if you want to use this fancy language, phenomenology is great discovery or breakthrough is that empirical history has a historicity, but the temporal horizon of how we subjects, we phenomenologists, try to articulate that historicity is not the worldly history that we've been taught or that made us. It's 2026, 1989, Cold War. You know, seems like there's another epoch emerging now. 9/11, maybe that was another epoch. Here we go again. Now, you want to desensitize that to open up the very finitude of all that because it's something prior. That's not given to us as human beings to discover and finally reveal the concepts that are given to us in Kant. That, to make nature itself, because of our thinking and the nature of our thinking, a problem, which it became for Kant, which was great. There was such a Copernican revolution there too. Heidegger acknowledges that in his piece. Thus, the only under the cover of static phenomenology reductions can we make our infinitely more subtle and hazardous reductions. Hazardous, dangerous. Keep on reducing everything, including what you're saying right now. You're going to get into trouble. It's going to get into this. Going to constantly be asking about the origin of that, the origin of that, the origin of, hazard, which yields both the singular essences of its institutive acts when anything gets founded, and their exemplary web, the whole sense of an open history in general. If you start talking about the historicity of history, what Foucault tried to do in the order of things, well, then the next step is, well, what's beneath that empirical history or that linear chronological time? Okay, archaeological ground, genealogical ground, the epistemes. Derrida will question that too. Derrida, Foucault, the battles of the epic there, because that too is subject to the trap of metaphysics reproducing something into present. But without this Wechselspiel interplay of this double reduction, phenomenology of historicity would be an exercise in vanity, as would be all phenomenology. At some point, let's give some credence to Husserl. He wants to figure this out. You might want to call him naive from a Derridean point of view, but it's a brave undertaking. And for Husserl in the 30s, there's this crisis in the sciences, and Heidegger's going to pick up on this. But Heidegger needs to talk about that crisis so he can separate his project, give the clear footing of his question, because everybody else screwed it up in the history of metaphysics, starting with the Greeks. They opened it up, but then it got forgotten. And I got to meet Heidegger, repose the whole thing. If we take for granted the philosophical nonsense, so it's Derrida, he's the one who's taking this stance, of a purely empirical history and the impotence of this ahistorical rationalism, then we realize the seriousness of what's at stake. Now that is freaking awesome. He's saying, so no linear time, no accumulated knowledge, no naive subject-object distinction. I'm the historian. I'm here. I'm not going to question if Trump is destroying the world or pretend it's not happening. I'm going to go get excited about some stuff about the past and just escape from this terror of today and go look at the Roman Empire. Talk about that. And ahistorical rationalism, the pre-Kantian dogmatic metaphysics that you think that it's just there out there waiting for you to solve the problems of metaphysics or logic or the paradoxes that the Greeks came up with. Or Russell talking about a set theory. I'm not worried about, I'm not going to question myself in a moment, my existence, my evolution to be in the world. It's just there's the problem, and I'm going to use whatever I got to see if I can come up with something. Both are avoided. Therefore, both time and, if you will, time as in progress in history or lack of progress, but also ready-made, truths that have eternal kind of substance or value. Okay, let's do the quick pivot to being in time. When I shift here, I don't know if the text appears. Can people see being in time, or do I have to stop sharing and bring it up again? This is not being in time. And to be specific,
No, it's being time. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Ontological priority of the question.
Great. Okay, so this is a brief section, and I want to draw our attention quickly to the ontological. This is section 3. It's a short 3 pages. He's coming back to it again. This is a very strange question. I'm not going to just pose it and answer it. That's not what this work is about. Maybe other philosophers through the history of metaphysics, they come up with their question and they spend the rest of the time trying to convince you that this is the answer to it. Simplification, of course, is that not Plato, it's a complex matter, but let's say Aristotle or Hegel, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, not human. Kant is honest, as both Heidegger and Derrida said, that he'll tell you at the end that he didn't answer he didn't finish. And of course, there are two other critiques that come after. The shift is to our own freedom to then let's be responsible and not pretend we can answer these questions of metaphysics to limit our ability to do so, but from that, transcend ourselves from the errors that we inherited and create a space to give ourselves our own kind of free will. Like that's derived a priori without being religious and metaphysical, but it's built into us. So that opens up the Kantian space. Here, Heidegger is saying this question it's going to turn out to be a peculiar one. Again, I'm not just going to pose this question so I can come up with the most general of generalities to try to answer it. But then here's the crux. And this is these paragraphs here get us into something remarkably eerily similar to what's going on with Derrida's engagement with Husserl on the history of science, the history of mathematics. Very curious to see. So to situate this here, we don't have all the pieces of the Dasein analytic. We're still talking about that question, the meaning of being reposed anew. We have no sense of the question. The question wasn't properly formulated. This entity that we're talking about called being is universal, it's necessary, it's empty. No trust in whatever we've been given about what that is, because we haven't put that to question, let alone our relationship to being the questioner, the inquirer. Return inquiry, what's wrong? Derrida, there doesn't seem to be even a statement about inquirer or inquirer or even a subject like Dasein. He comes much later than both these guys. But he didn't start with like, oh, the writer or the thinker. It's not just about the text either. All that's being suspended, hazardous suspension reduction. But here, Heidegger, 1927, in this Western metaphysical, logocentric, if you want to use those words, trappings, being is always the being of an entity, not a non-entity, or the profound concept of emptiness in Eastern Buddhistic philosophical traditions. It's of an entity. Totality of entities can, in accordance with its various domains, become a field for laying bare and delimiting certain definite areas of subject matter. These areas on their part, for instance, history, nature, space, life, Dasein, language, history of everything, right? Can serve as objects which corresponding scientific investigations may take as their respective themes. They're not going to question the sense making that went into these items or terms. They just assume them, but they assume them to be probed and explored. They won't define them, but they're already there and as terms. And then they can question, hey, they're shifting meanings or what is it? They can do what science, social science, quite frankly, humanists do. In order to take on the being of these things, you have to assume that they're there, entities. Scientific research accomplishes roughly and naively the demarcation and initial fixing of areas of subject. You can't go up to a scientist and say, what's your subject matter field? And they'd say nothing. Or a cosmologist. I want to meet a cosmologist who's focused on our own solar system, the stars, Mercury, the composition of helium. And I say, hey, what's your subject matter area? They're like, oh, nothing. And then they stop talking. No, they're all busy studying something. Heidegger, Husserl is too, but Heidegger and Derrida. Okay, what's your subject matter, Derrida? or Heidegger? The basic structures of any such area have already been worked out. See, ready made after a fashion in our pre-scientific ways of experiencing and interpreting the domain of being in which the area of subject matter itself is confined. This eerie kind of thing here. Remember that pre-geometric experience? Material ontology, inscription, the archaic phrase, the non-origin of the origin. The sense wasn't already formed in the origin. But I'm not going to tell you the empirical building up of the first theorem, the first geometric event. I don't want to just valorize it with some great genius or revolutionary event. The basic concepts which thus arise remain our approximate clues for disclosing this area concretely for the first time. So that's his ambition. And although research may always lean towards this positive approach, its real progress comes not so much from collecting results and storing them away in manuals, as from inquiring into the ways in which each particular is basically constituted. That Grundverfassung, and translators tell us, don't think of constitution, anatomy, legal constitution, but how are you doing? How are you made up? What's your state right now? Maybe your health. It's that kind of possibility. Sense, an inquiry to which we've been driven mostly by reacting against just such an inquiry. We don't want to learn any more about how the sciences do what they do. It's not a theory of knowledge, how they came to choose their subjects, and what are they expect to discover. That's not the point. And that's because we're relativists and we hate science. That's not the issue at all. No, look at this one. The real, and he's using this as an analogy for himself. And of course, he's going to destroy all this. They're all ontic. Look at the example he's going to give us. I want to pause with the theology and open it up. The real movement of this movement, what? Of the sciences takes place when their basic concepts undergo a more or less radical revision, which is transparent to itself. A little bit of history here. 1905, the special theory of relativity. 1915, general theory. Einstein didn't get his empirical proof until 1919. He had to sit around and wait. Light from Mercury bends around the sun. Oh, okay. The warping of gravity is the force that warps space-time. It forces things to curve and bend because of extreme density. Great, Einstein. And Einstein's it's a classical case. Oh, how'd you do that? How'd you come up with this? I don't know. And, oh, what if you didn't get your empirical proof, Einstein? Well, he goes, oh, I feel sorry for God. If I were to create the universe, this is how I would imagine it. Imagination, or children ask endless questions. Yet it's boundless imagination. But adults have reason and can experiment and can test to delimit, imagination. So anyway, the point is that you don't want to ask the great thinker or great mind, how did you do this? That's not the project. The more or less concepts undergo a more less radical vision, which is transferred to the level which a science has reached is determined by how far it is capable of a crisis in its basic concepts. This is fascinating. This is long before Kuhn or most modern historians and philosophers of science. In such imminent crises, the very relation between positively investigative inquiry and those things themselves that are under interrogation come to a point where it begins to totter. In the various disciplines everywhere today, there are freshly awakened tendencies to put research on new foundations. Okay, this is Heidegger's ambition, which people say, the scholars will say he gave up fundamental ontology, and Derridean deconstruction will then cleverly, creatively deal with that question of the collapse and the failure that it means for the future philosophy and metaphysics. But Heidegger is just using his analogies. Hey, the sciences are going through crises. And here's the history of metaphysics and philosophy. Up to his time, you got neo-Kantianism, you got phenomenology, you got Jaspers and the psychology of worldviews, theologies, Protestant theologies, has its own mini revolutions going on, which Heidegger will talk about in a second. So all these things are happening, and yet for Heidegger, nothing's happening. There's no real investigation into the meaning of the question of being, because we haven't even asked the question of the meaning of the question for ourselves, to ourselves. We haven't questioned the question. We just sort of take it and inhabit it, try to do something and answer it. That's not the revolution. That's not the state. That's not the real foundation. Derrida is not going to go for foundations. Husserl doesn't get to any foundations. Derrida has a different perspective, but Heidegger, at least here, is early Heidegger. So what's happening in the sciences? I'm going to stop here with the section of theology. The whole section ends here. I'll read this italics of his quote to end it. Let's just go through what's happening for Heidegger in his time that's saying, well, you know what? There's all these crises happening elsewhere. And Good for them, but for the fundamental ontologist who has an ontological question about the meaning of being and our relationship to it, therefore what it can illuminate about ourselves, not as humans, as subjects or objects of history, or psychology of the sciences, or religion, or anything else, but this openness, suspendedness, transcendence, thrownness, you know, the anxiety about that, but the excitement and the result that we get if we can get to that quote unquote moment of vision of what we're supposed to do to take care of ourselves. Take care, Zorga. That's the whole being in time, right? Well, let's see what's happening in these other areas that, okay, this is how they're responding to the crisis, but we're going to do something. Heidegger's saying we're going to do something different. Derrida's saying phenomenological historicity, that's different than even what Husserl is attempting to do. Mathematics, which is seemingly the most rigorous and the most firmly constructed of sciences, has reached its crisis in its foundations. He knew that from the late 19th century, which got Frege and Husserl going. And within mathematics itself, Cantor, if you know those figures, Hilbert, there wouldn't be any Einstein framework that's mathematized if it wasn't for some other guys. Riemann, non-Euclidean geometry, there's all kinds of stuff happening. Wildly imaginative, mind-blowing things happening. But reached a crisis in the controversy between the formalists and the intuitionists. The issue is one of obtaining and securing the primary way of access to what are supposedly the objects of this science. Einstein's relativity theory of physics arises from the tendency to exhibit the interconnectedness of nature as it is in itself. So after Kant, let's really get back to the question. Oh, space and time, let's connect them. Let's make them four-dimensional. 3 dimensions of space, like a box. 1 dimension of time, past, present, future. That's the whole structure, and all kinds of funny, weird things can happen to it. The presence of extremely massive objects, black holes. Quantum theory, which I don't think he mentions here, that comes a little bit later, is dealing with the bizarre level of the small, in which every assumption is thrown out. So formalization, but our normal intuitions are being threatened because people don't, including Einstein, don't want to admit those kind of things. Causality into distance. I can know the position of something, but I can't know its momentum, vice versa. Particle wave. So, crisis, as a theory of conditions under which we have access to it serves to preserve, that's what the scientist wants, the changelessness of the laws of motion, but taking into account the relativities and all frameworks. That's ambitious. Okay, you still want all those physical laws. That's what they go after, right? But they have all this complexity and confusion, and thus come up against the question of the structure of its own given area of study of the problem of matter. In biology, the vitalism of that time mechanism, I guess it's before DNA, to a much larger notion of life in biomedical sense. So there's some kind of change there. And then in the human sciences, after Delta, which are historiological in character, the urge towards the historical actuality itself has been strengthened in the course of time by tradition and the way the tradition is presented and handed down. And Husserl picks up this in Origin of Geometry. Derrida picks up on this. Let's go to this footnote because we need a lot of these fine distinctions here that we can contrast with what we see in Derrida's historicity problem. Historischen Geisteswissenschaften. Heidegger makes a distinction between history and Geschichte and the corresponding adjectives historisch and geschichtlich. History stands for what Heidegger calls a science of history. Modern history, get a PhD in history, historiography, historical methods, archives, causality, different philosophies of history over time. Max Weber, he didn't say 1500 Protestant ethics, as weird as they were back then, when 1600 experiments with that New England, Puritans, Calvinists, created the industrial capitalist, or were the first. That came 200 years later. Elective affinity, family resemblance, something weird, historical thesis. Actuality needs a deeper explanation from history itself that gives us the tools to explain something like causality. But science of history, Geschichte usually stands for the kind of history that actually happens. Think about how horrific all the events are right now in the world. That's history happening. But history is a science. We shall, as a rule, translate respectively historiology and history following similar conventions. So this is not history. Um, and eventually, when we get to Division Two, there is no Geschichte. There's Geschehen, and there's Geschick, just destiny, and the Schicksal, and the fate. And Geschehen is historizing an occurrence, and Geschichtlichkeit has the ontological historicality of all these things. And we're not there yet, but this is something more primordial than even something like history. And if you question that, you get into trouble because we're supposed to learn from the mistakes of history. Bad things happen in history. Look at the 20th century. You can't just say, oh, that's just some construction and it's derived from something deeper. And then here's where I want to kind of end because it brings us back to, I think, a lot of the things we've been picking up on about the responsibility aspects, the meaning aspect, the authenticity aspect, the concern care aspect, if we care about each other as human beings. Theology is seeking a more primordial interpretation of man's being towards God. Think about Karl Barth, 1917, some other guys too. He's the big guy. It's radical kind of renewal. This is amazing. Think about this. More primordial interpretation of man's being towards God. Buber's doing this for Judaism, just in Rosenzweig, if you want to think about that tradition. But if you want to take the Christian one, which is what Heidegger is taking, being towards God prescribed by the meaning of faith itself and remaining within it. So once again, Tillich, these are all students, by the way, of Barth, but Tillich and Warner, the Catholic tradition, a bunch of other guys who studied under the young Heidegger. So relation of man's being towards God, meaning of faith renewed, not just the confessions and the doctrines say, I gotta believe all this, gotta read the Bible, gotta accept everything that's being told to me, but something that comes from within, the grace of that kind of thrown openness of why I want to commit to this particular religion. It illuminates this relationship between man's being and God. It's more sophisticated than just picture stories that you teach kids about the story of Jesus, what happens in the Gospels. It's slowly beginning to understand once more what Luther did 500 years ago, that any foundation on which the system of dogma rests has not arisen from an inquiry in which faith is primary. So Luther put his stake, solus fides, the text, only Christ. No intermediaries, no hierarchies, no church, no rituals, no sacraments. Me, the Bible, God, what's given to me, the primary experience of faith, but from a philosophically enriched way of talking about that, that can then illuminate what the doctrine is, not the other way around. Doctrine telling the kid, hey, you got to believe this. Nope. Got to come from this existential experiential sense from which I can then come to my own understanding. Conceptually, this foundation not only is inadequate for the problematic of theology, so no more scholastics, no more metaphysical systems, but in fact, these concepts and foundations in dogmatics conceal and distort something more primary than simply primary. Very important for Heidegger, even though he's not going to take the British route. After at this point, for sure. Not in being time, as far as we know, not after. But there's this more than math and whatever, what do you talk about? History, biology, that, he's going to come close to this. The meaning of everything. What's at most at stake? Derrida's last sentence. You see what's at stake. Okay, so what is ontology? Okay, it's not going to be any of those ontic sciences. And this is where we get to ontological, ontological. They're not explicitly defined here, but it's a kind of say ontological inquiries concern primarily with being. Ontological inquiries concern primarily with entities and facts about them. Even having presupposing God for religious people is a being, therefore an entity. Maybe not a simple one, like the Christian God, three persons equal one God, or this idea of the incarnation, or the Holy Spirit. I mean, those aren't simple. I don't know that. But entities that are there to have a relationship to. Again, it's not a relationship to nothing, or you can't go up to a Christian, a full-blown Christian, and take the Christ out of the thing, out of the structure, and say, okay, what do you believe in? Raj's coffee cup. That's the Christian God. I mean, you can make that stretch. Maybe there's versions of Christianity way out there where you can expand it to that level of panentheism and pantheism. But you know what I mean. You can't take the thing, engine out of the car, and expect it to drive. So we're not dealing with entities here. Everybody's ontic, including the theologians who are talking about the most important thing. So are the physicists. They think they're talking about the universe. And, that's it. Ideal truths that are self-contained and are not empirical. Pure, beautiful. No. What are we doing here between Heideggerian destruction, Derridean deconstruction? All ontology, no matter how rich and firmly compacted a system of categories it has at its disposal, remains blind and perverted from its own most aim. It is, if it has not first adequately clarified the meaning of being and conceived this clarification as its fundamental task. So how do we do this contrast here? Clarify the question of the meaning of being. Don't assume, suspend anything like what you think meaning is, and certainly being. Don't draw from anyone else. Sorry, other fields of knowledge production. Can't take from the theologians. This is the uncanniness of being thrown as human beings without someone prescribing some definition of what that means to us. We're pulled with compulsion, not just because we know we're going to die by watching other people die, and we know it's going to happen to us. There's a deeper kind of care and uncanniness goes into the anxiety of being thrown at, but then engaged in this radical transcendence. And then for Derrida's part, he finds at least something at stake in Husserl that opens up everything, puts at stake why something has been authorized to us as a tradition of truth. Not because we want to be relativists and skeptics and say, I don't believe in truth. I don't believe in vaccines. That's not it. It's about the relationship, the movement, the passage, the inheritance, but not some simple empirical events. My dad will, once he goes, he's an old guy, probably give me and my brother a little bit of his, whatever he created. Those are empirical points. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the origin of metaphysics, logic, science, truth, philosophy, but suspending that idea of the origin, but also what we're supposed to do in relationship to the question. So you can see kind of like the two here, and like at least at this stage, question the meaning of being still has to be worked out. Um, the ontic realm is not going to give it to us. In Heidegger's circle, Dasein, because he has to start somewhere, and you would think it means us as human beings. All interpreters take it to be that way. I kind of don't. It's therefore I'm not involved in Heidegger scholarship. But if you don't want to make being a time about human beings, then get out of here. That's what they tell me. Yeah, but I don't. I think maybe it's the Derridean. I take the Derridean approach to this via the Husserl to come back to this text, which is what we said we're going to do, to try to reimagine what could be happening inside being in time. Okay, let me stop here. I didn't do the Kant piece. Maybe it'll come up. And the only reason I want to introduce a very small passage in Kant's Schematism is that he talks about geometry. And it's the famous point before the Schematism chapter starts, that our understanding of roundness in the plate can be intuited in the category of circle, but that intuition is not derived from experience because, they're circular objects, but you're never going to see a pure circle, especially the mathematical description of it. It's stupid to think, oh yeah, I have an experience of this round object as my mathematical theorem. You can have an intuition of mathematical theorem, but that's not going to come from experience. And this is where Derrida says to Kant, look, don't go back to the subjectivity of the human being and how was this fashioned in terms of the intuition or relation of intuitions in the categories that we use to come up with a theorem. It's not derived from experience, that's for sure. Anyway, that's the Kant piece. But Kant is in a subject, and he's not dealing with historicity as far as Derrida is concerned. If he is, it's a naive history. It's the valorizing history. Oh yeah, that great Western guy, the Greeks, took from those half thought ideas of coming out of the East for Egypt and eventually Babylon. But this is more important than even the European discovery of the other world. It's the Kant quote that we saw. the Cape. There's colonial implications not to be dismissed, but that's where he situates. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. I sorry if this was if you feel like okay, if you want to begin to challenge the readings, please do so. Where would we like to begin our discussion? The direct Derrida text, coming back to being time, or throw away everything I just said. And how did you interpret the text? You got Paul?
Can I suggest we begin in primary school with children learning about geometry? Um, and there are two ways, I think, in which learning functions. One is the teacher giving a lesson, drawing on the tradition, drawing on Euclid, drawing on maybe Kant. Um, the other, but you can go through the motions of doing that, but the kid doesn't learn it. And Husserl mentions this. He mentions a kind of science that is just going through the motions, just churning out the formulae. And he associates that with a certain formalistic approach to science. But on the other hand, there is the point when the kid gets the theorem.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not necessarily related to the tradition because many people just learn to do it by rote, but they don't get it. And the question is, where does this moment of getting it come from? Is it a repetition of someone getting it a long time ago? Probably not. It doesn't make some sense. Is it some sort of intuition, like Kant thinks? Again, there are lots of problems with that idea, as you just outlined in your brief description of Kant on the roundness of the plate. And it strikes me this is a very practical application of it about the teaching of mathematics, the teaching of science, teaching of anything. There's a pedagogical side to this. And I thought it was very interesting that you put focus on that quotation from the end of that section of on the origin of geometry, where he talks about what he's talking about there is the ethical consequences, about the nonsense of empiricism and the impotence of a historical rationalism. And he says that somehow between those two that don't work is the seriousness of the problem that is at stake. And I would suggest that's a problem that is at stake ethically and pedagogically every day.
And Paul, can I ask you, he's 31, 1962, and he writes this, and he's by no means institutionalized in the French Academy. And we know what happens in the 60s. He systematically takes on every big guy. He's not going to make any friends here.
No, it's a very hard thing to say. And you're right, it opens up a lot of questions that we still don't have the answer.
I mean, these phrases, open history, the Weltgespiel, to give Husserl some credit, if you go back to the text, this is the big passage he quotes from Husserl. The scientific investigator of nature behaves quite differently. Descartes' hallucination, like how I know that this is not just a fantasy in the genesis of the ideas. Because at some point before they get the empirical proof, if they're just theorizing, like Einstein, doing all those little thought experiments, not little that's consequential, understanding the entire universe for physicists, but he didn't get that empirical proof, but he had to. It's a strange behavior, but once it's in place, that's repeatable and teachable, as you said. But even the crossing the threshold for the kid, we won't know. Kids emerging into language, Wittgenstein's interested in that. I'm watching it now between the 1 and the 3-year-old doing it. Or I don't know how many ways you can try to teach 2 plus 2 equals 4. Forget about geometry, but just lining up some toothpicks and partitioning it out. There is a crossing of the threshold. I mean, this is able normative assumptions here. You can talk about disability too, phenomenologically, and maybe someday I hope we can get to that. But on this issue of disparities in something like mathematics, why is it dominated by certain groups of people, and then that cisgendered men compared to women? There are all kinds of complicated debates about this. But to give credit to this idea that, okay, if you want to do the philosophy history of the geometric project, that's what the philosophy and history of science is about. But this phenomenological reduction of that to get to something else. Let me ask anyone, and again, we're keeping Heidegger's text in parallel. Derrida, Husserl, and Heidegger are bound to fail if they're going to admit that if you think the point of posing a question is to get an answer, and you make the question so hard that there is no answer, well, you're never going to be able to get to it. I don't know if that's the state that Derrida is talking about. You mentioned Paul at the end here. You see what's at stake. But I'd say for Husserl and Heidegger, Heidegger's so busy talking about foundations, he wouldn't be engaged in that book, which he then gave up. He didn't go back to it. He did, everything kind of changed for him. He said the same intuition was there, same question and same impetus, but realized that the way you speak about these things, it doesn't work in the way he tried to do it there, let alone try to answer the question, which he did. And do you think Derrida is beginning at a point where, even that's not what's at stake for us? Being in time was bound to fail at the beginning. Michael, sorry.
The same hard questions that Derrida asked about the origin of geometry, you can ask about the origin of the idea of being. And that it's interesting that very first quotation in Being at Time is from Aristotle talking about the pre-Socratic. So it's already inserted within quite a long tradition. Heidegger mentions in this section that we're looking at today, he mentions Brandeis and his idea that the idea of being in the philosophical sense comes from the nature of the Greek language and is intimately related to that and may be different in a language such as Portuguese, which has two different words for being. But obviously you can abstract out of that into some more philosophical idea of being. But then where does that insight come from? I think this is the question that Derrida asks, and it relates to this question of being and the way Aristotle uses that, which is sort of the birth of modern logic as well, relates to that equally as it relates to geometry. I suppose the difference is that we don't teach ontology in schools, but we teach geometry, which is another question.
It's interesting because if you do political, economic, social, cultural history, cultural history, that's one thing. Do the history of science. Did I say economic history? Yeah. You do the history of science, that's one thing. But for Heidegger and Derrida, Heidegger is talking about these crises in mathematics, very abstract field, crisis of physics. He hadn't even gotten to the crisis between relativity and quantum mechanics. Protestant theology, the revolutions of the early 20th century, that reinstituted the epistle to the Mormons is what people talk about Bart, just as kind of a World War I, but just this neo-Lutheran, neo-Pauline moment of nothing short of the rush and the parousia, this full other expectation, how you think about the end, which gets repeated as people are doing it today. But to do it in a theologically sophisticated way, so you don't just talk about some kind of simplistic end. Think about temporality in a complex way, which is what Heidegger is rooted in with Bultmann and others. He's talking about some very complex things, and then saying, okay, well, that's all I'm gonna take. I'm over here in ontology, which is, eventually the metaphysics that has to go with ontology to pose this question of meaning of being, and then his real problem is time. And when Derrida talking about the desedimentation and phenomenological historicity that makes possible the responsibility we have to question. Maybe is the only thing that allows for the first breakthroughs to occur anyway. Not because we want to be revolutionary geniuses, but because if we don't question it, then how do we open up that space of not just freedom, that sounds inauthentic or superficial, that open history, so we're not slaves to it. So I just think that they both are coming at this issue of history for their projects, which are at this stage very philosophical, and yet they're both in different ways, 60, 50 years apart, looking at something else, in this case geometry, and that's for Derrida, Heidegger mentions those other fields, because they're abstract. And at some point, they don't involve if they reach that level of abstraction, they don't involve human beings. And although Heidegger mentions Christian theology and Derrida mentions God and telos here in the footnotes, he's not talking about theology, certainly not any kind of Christian theology. But neither is Heidegger. I think that's kind of like we're trying to get to. Is like where is that? How does that relate to their idea of this mystery and openness of history, this uncanniness? Because if you're going to do this hazardous suspension of everything, it's like it's insane. You're asking about the origin of geometry without involving the human beings that were the first discoverers, and you're not doing it because you want to go back and talk to a bunch of geometricians today, like, hey, how do you do what you do? Or what do you think about the genius of Riemann? I sometimes I try to walk into the sciences and they have like 2 seconds. Because I do that. I do ask them, wow, Riemann must have been amazing, right? Like, I'm trying to get a cup of coffee here. I got to finish this lecture for my class. They don't want to talk about that. I do, because I'm like, what, who the hell is this Riemann guy? Non-Euclidean geometry, which is so important for the foundations of what's being talked about today. So anyway, the point is that they're getting to a level of abstraction, but did they not also mention a concretion? This is the most concrete of experiences.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sense of necessity. That's my word. In both the investigations of Heidegger and of Derrida that are compelling. You have no choice, and so they've uncovered that. So they claim, and are pursuing in the language and logic that's appropriate to each of them the nature of the investigation according to that necessity. And I think the stakes of it for each thinker are, again, my word, absolute. There's no, they're not messing around. And so they can say things. Yeah, they can say things like, hey, you completely missed this. Or, Derrida at the end, if you want to do this nonsense philosophy, it's a little play on words, right? He says nonsense. There's no
Right.
sense to right. The purely empirical, the powerlessness of this is ahistorical, and then now how important it is that we do it, because otherwise you're just banging against the wall.
By the way, the
And
no sense is also empty. Can you imagine telling
yeah,
them
yeah,
this is
yeah,
empty,
yeah,
like
yeah,
vacuums?
yeah. It's even worse than nonsense, right? There's nothing there. Although later Derrida might say, and that's correct, there is nothing there. But to me, it's the compulsion of a certain notion of necessity in the language of each of the thinkers that is so exciting to read. I the other thing for me, Raj, that reading this is so enjoyable, particularly the Derrida and the whole notion of origin, is it reminds me of when I first read this
Mm-hmm.
Origin of Geometry way back when I was like 25, trying to make sense of the logical investigations. And then, there's Husserl, and then there's Heidegger, and then there's more Derrida. And I'm involved in that reassigning sense to what it was that I first read in Derrida at that point in time, and just
Wow.
going in, different circles around what that might mean. And because I was like, oh, this guy's just a magician, and this is just one big, mental acrobatic tour, um, right? Which I think the translator says the Ricoeur had some sort of similar comment about Derrida,
The
but
review.
you,
Oh, interesting.
yeah, yeah, that ultimately it just becomes mental gymnastics. But it's so serious for
There you
both,
go.
for Heidegger and for Derrida. And the scale of what Derrida is doing here is just amazing. He's got to show, Husserl is of a piece. What we see here at the beginning is what we see at the end. Not only that, but Husserl's
Hmm.
understanding of the quote unquote history of science is lodged in the Western philosophy of the history of science, such as we see here with Kant. I can trace, that's a deliberate word on my part, I can trace this through. Here are the aporias that emerge with this. And, ultimately, he's not quite there, but ultimately, says Derrida, here's my project. It's also the another similarity, and I'll shut up after this. Another similarity between the two is how much of little throwaway comments in both Heidegger and in Derrida show up here and then emerge later in their work. I think the point about theology is one. You've got the notion, the reference to theology here and being in time, and then the whole discourse, which is mind blowing, around the last gods and the Beiträge, and you can see, oh no,
Hmm.
it's here already.
Right.
He's it's already lodged in there,
Sure.
and the Derrida has some remark in here. I think it's with the Kant commentary. He's like, it's like birth, or maybe I should say birth certificate. And it's like, okay, and you can just
Right.
disentangle that. I mean, that's
Certifying authority,
yeah, yeah. That there's,
authorizing.
it's the writing.
Hey,
It's
this happened.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's the whole notion of origin, and it's like, yeah. So you, dear reader, you were
Well,
born, and you only got real because someone wrote it on their birth certificate.
yeah.
So I just think it's amazing stuff to read.
It
So
gives nominalism a new
thank you.
spin to your own birth and existence.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah,
Well,
yeah.
this when you talk about seriousness and it's unfortunate the dismissals and he's not a terrorist. He's not a bad guy. He's a little
No,
guy, and he wasn't mean. He was like the nicest, if you will. I mean, how do I put this? I don't think there was anything mean about the person. It's just the opposite. I felt
yeah,
like with the excess of this kind of mind comes this kind of compassion to the other, which Levinas, of course, he has a long relationship with him and also with Jacob. But you mentioned Kant, and we might want to then bring up the skepticism section. But I forgot to mention that piece among the different revolutions in being in time. If I can do that real quick, is um, where does he say it? I could have sworn it shows up here with math, biology, theology, the productive logic. Oh, here we go. I can just do this a little bit. Um, so laying the foundations for the sciences was different in principle from the kind of logic which limps along after investigating the status of some science as its chances to find it in order to discover its method. I don't know if that's a dig on Hegel. I don't want to say that here, but if that's what you're claiming, okay, after Plato and Aristotle, you really want to get to the science of logic. And for Hegel, it's really the self-presentation, the idea is the method of what he's trying to show, what kind of distinctions. Phenomenology is the way to set up that question for him. It's like phenomenology is his being intent, setting up the question, and the science of logic answers it. There is no science of logic provided. It's not about that. Laying the foundations, as we described, is rather productive logic. You have to leap ahead of this. You want to, if Derrida the architrace, which is not prior to like very early as in time origin, but what is other to that sense that we're, that in a way is delayed because it's arriving to us. On the other hand, it's different because we can't reduce it to any kind of conception. Um, and there's a lot coming from Husserl, quite frankly, on the categorical intuition and study of flesh that Merleau-Ponty picks up on. But what that means is just, the suspension at some point takes that essential descriptions of your experience, not your consciousness, and it has its own materiality, but phenomenality to it. It's like that essence of experiencing, not the thing in your home office, but the act of being open for the first time to have an intuition. Now, Kant's schematism, I don't want to reduce that. That's why I would like to show you the passage there. We can, but let's see what Heidegger says. In the sense that it leaps ahead, as it were, into some area of being, disclose it for the first time in the constitution. Is this the origin of geometry, for example? After thus arriving at the structures within it, makes these available to the positive sciences as transparent assignments for their inquiry. Something else prior has to have to be clear, disclosed. Something that occurs, maybe the problem arises. There's an interplay between observation and matter, of course. There's experimentation. But before their projects are set, so then they go and try to discover something like the cause of cancer, or the cure to cancer, cause and cure to cancer. What had to be cleared prior? Because that's what he's going to have to do for that clearing, destroying project to set up his analytic, to then pose the fundamental question of ontology, the fundamental question of debate. Well, to give an example, look at this. What is philosophically primary is neither a theory of concept formation of historiology, what we would call in English historiography, how historians deploy certain concepts or ideas, nor the theory of historical knowledge. Plenty of philosophers of history, and since the late 18th century, historicists try to come up with what the heck is historical knowledge. How do you avoid, simply put, subjective bias in the present? Can you get to the objective representation? How to temporalize? Nor a theory of history, like what the heck is history when we make it the object of the science or the study of history? Like what is that entity we call history? Not just chronological time. What is primary is rather the interpretation. This gets to the division two, which we don't have yet. But I'll just tell you that authentic historical entities is Geschehen, occurrence, historizing movement, not of history in the historical present, Trump engaging in these horrific actions. But the ontological disclosure that makes it possible for us to even be in history and have a sense that we're in something, that's the more primordial, that's the uncanny part, Michael Lee, that could get to some, I want to call it theological, but some bizarre realm that then puts us in a position to then feel the way we do about what it's like to be in history. That's a more difficult project to get to that deeper ground. Here's our Kant. The positive outcome of Kant's critique of pure reason lies in what it has contributed towards working out what belongs to any nature, our subject, our objectivity, their relationship, the subsumptions he talks about, the third that's going to mix the intelligible and the sensible, which is the schema. That's the third mediating thing that has to be pure, which turns out to be this time determination that allows us to link up our representations to then even get that first sense of the manifold that we're getting, to apply a concept to say, okay, well, yeah, I'm going to say that this is this. That's right there in the schematism, the beginnings of the schematism. So Kant delimits, now it's not the external world that's going to provide its own laws ready-made, we just got to go discover it. It's not the subjectivist, constructivist, well, I'm just going to make up whatever I want. No, these are given. They're a priori. Let's use them. But if we have a clearer way of how we go about doing things, we could probably avoid making the mistakes that we did. So if you want to call that progress, but yeah, a priori logic for the subject matter area that's being called, that's interesting. Transcendental logic for nature, the beginnings of idealism. Fichte and Schelling have to take it elsewhere. Derrida, to his credit, he actually footnotes Hegel to talk about the critique. But I guess it comes back to this weird question about when we get deeper into Heidegger and Derrida's, again, not a simple reproduction of, by any means, whether there's so much that we have to figure out in terms of the connection. And there's all these radical departures too. But I guess what they have in common, the ontological difference, being, question meaning being, destruction of the history of how that was posed, emptying it out, don't reduce it to an entity, including something transcendental like God or Einstein's space-time and black holes. No human beings there. Very complex. Or the complex of mathematics. Those are all entities in an optic sense. And then difference, which has to make its appearance eventually, I think, very soon. Well, the simple etymology of it, which is the event of differentiation. But even that event is not present. See after the fact, but that presupposes it before. There's an Aramaic saying in the infancy Gospels in the Qumran, Q source for the Gospels. Don't show up in the actual canonical Gospels of Christianity, but one we can't say Jesus is split the wood apart and finally there. But being there, I like that splitting it. The event of splitting, before or after it, the wholeness of the thing, the there-ness of, or like a kid might ask, oh, like my kid might ask, oh, I'll break apart the wood and you're going to find a little bug or something inside there. Is that what he's saying? What's not saying? But it's that event of differentiation, and it's also the delay. That's arriving to us still ethically for us to come to some understanding of this primordial difference that's there prior to any kind of stable identity. It's not dialectical. It's not because the identity is concealing its negation. You got to negate that. It's an alpha, and you get to a higher synthesis. Deconstruct, not that. Deconstruction will do a lot of interesting things with the beyond dialectics. That's not what that is. It's something else. So I guess that's what we're going to have to arrive to, is those two ideas, which are very difficult. Because if you attempt to name, conceptualize, represent those things, you're falling back into metaphysics, which is now closed for Derrida, but it doesn't end, which is the infinite task. So I know that's kind of racing ahead, but do we feel like at least this problem of historicity seems to be at the root of both projects right now? But, we have no idea what the hell that means.
No, but I think one thing, the caricature Heidegger and the caricature Derrida is that the history is reviewed simply to show inadequacy, flaws, holes, what they didn't think. And the more I read these texts now, and maybe just because I'm older than I was once, and we always are, it's the seriousness of each thing, each historical figure, each issue that they bring up, just how important each of them are to Heidegger and to Derrida. So he doesn't just happen, Derrida, to ruminate upon Husserl. The Husserl, in his honesty and perhaps ultimately inadequacy, has revealed things here that are very, very important for us to pay attention to. And I that's what I really enjoy about Derrida and Heidegger. And the solicitousness of Derrida might be a little more tonally apparent here than Heidegger. I mean, he's a German after all, but I think I mention Kant not because I'm going to disregard him, says Heidegger, but because here's what's important and serious about it. Let's look at that more closely.
Well, by the way, Aristotle.
Yeah. Yeah. Not to mention Aristotle and Plato, who are swimming in the sea of being. Yeah.
Manifold being, but for Husserl, and of course, it's all Aristotle and Kant. He starts talking about Kant.
Yeah.
Now, my big stick here for the Heidegger world is that they left out Hegel, both Heidegger, and a little too late. He got a lot of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche early on. And he ends up in the end, and he does go to dissertation and he concludes being done with that. It's always like he's always too late. And Derrida, for his part, that's a more complicated story. We'll have to get to it. Paul, I don't know if you recommend that we attempt to do law, but if the group, you never done law, you should try to do it. Thank you, Zach. Sorry, we can get your perspective next week, but next time. But the Derrida Hegel piece, I mean, that's a whole, we get to of spirit for sure, and Claw and other places. But I take the Hegel inside Derrida very seriously too, Michael, which is when we get to dissemination. There's nothing in the Western imagination that allows it to get to what's called the full side. It's always a three. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, past, present, future. Trinity, Magenta, Christian God. Three is that's the name of the game. What the heck is the fourth side? Or the quaternity in Hegel. That's what idea we just mentioned. And the fourfold in Heidegger. I know this like throwing out a lot of stuff, but yeah. Maybe it's that reactivation of sense that is a binding of us to these questions that float above history and below them. Yeah, they pass through the text and the thinkers, but we're not out for a subjectivist account of the thinkers. Nor are we telling a tale of accumulation and madness, as Heidegger says. But we're connected, but something's incomplete, the destiny part. Destiny for Heidegger, arrival for Derrida. I don't want to turn these guys into something religious or spooky, but could ask the question, well, how do we pose a question of the meaning of these philosophies? And Derrida would just tell you a bunch of names, deconstruction. Oh, well, okay, it's justice. Oh, it's Marxism. Oh, it's this, it's that. Hey, he was pushing back as poor guy was like, hey, tell us what this is. Or what's this method? Oh, that's when the first suspension begins. Like, what the heck is that? What are you talking about? How do we have an authentic encounter is what you probably want to say, and how you even asked me the question. You want to know what's underneath my shirt? Like, why are you bothering me? I'm just trying to like imagine that. But is that not the open, it's not the Vex spiel, is that what you call it, but the interplay? Wouldn't that be like authentic dialogues in some kind of Socratic sense? Friendship? I don't know. What, it's too far for you, Michael?
Yeah, I don't know. Like, what do you think when you hear who's the Italian philosopher? Agamben?
Agamben.
Agamben. Sometimes when I hear him talk, I think it's just play. There's just it's and the guys he can keep 185 balls in the air at once. Mention something, I'll work it into the discourse here. It'll be amazing. But at the end of the day, what's at stake here? What's important, what's necessary, what's worth paying attention to? And I think those are questions that, and this may simply be a matter of emotional tonality for me, those are better answered by a Heideggerian approach to the world or a Derridean approach to the world than whatever the approach of the world is now for Zizek and
others. I agree.
Yeah.
And that's the generation that exists now, and these guys ended a long time ago.
They're great players, and as I say that, it's like, oh, I'm criticizing the philosophical equivalent of John Coltrane and Miles Davis, and saying, who cares about that stuff? And but it's unbelievable what they're able to, put forth, both in terms of text and in terms of, speaking. And Derrida bears some responsibility for that, maybe. I don't know, because his ability to speak at a conference was just, I was like, wow, I feel like I've been swimming in the ocean here for 2-3 hours. It's just the intellectual majesty was just astounding.
Sure. Well, the density and the clarity.
Yeah.
Because Levinas's density or Blanchot's density or some of these other figures that you might encounter, Merleau-Ponty, so many different generations of figures. I mean, there's an impeccable clarity to someone like Deleuze, but there's no the Hegel Heidegger piece in terms of the rootedness of it. Foucault too was the most famous because he was applied everywhere. It's a big thing at the time. But here he is coming along, and every single one of these guys, he's already undoing the hidden aporias beneath them, trying to bring them to light as a type of clearing, desedimentation. And to think about that ethically, just like that, we talked about the ethical responsibility belt to those very early moments in being in time, just how he deals with the Plato passage. Both guys are really, when Derrida says in Lucien Grammet, time is that name time in the West. I know, of course, it's derived from times. And, German has its roots in the Latin, and of course, Greek had multiple registers. Kairos is one for the theological, Christological sense, for chronos, linear time. The trappings, when he gets into this question of the trace of this obliteration in Heidegger's ontological difference, the difference between being and being has to be forgotten in order for the history of ontology and metaphysics and being to arise as a pre-made question, and then attempts to answer it: monad, spirit, forms. Yeah, so that history at least is no E. So the obliteration of the difference between being and beings, that will never come to presence. And yet there's a retention of the trace, not of what the distinction is for us, but kind of like a production of that. He says this in the erasure of the difference, the trace comes. And it's up to us to be attentive then to the text or the canon or the archive of this whole thing called Western philosophy. As you said, fine was at most at stake in what these other guys were trying to grope for, to give them their due respect, if it's a Husserl or Kant, what have you, Plato or here or there. So yeah, the critique of Heidegger begins with, look, there's this forgetfulness. He's the passage to the other beginning. The culmination apparently is Hegel. So to get other to Hegel, which has never been achieved, as he says in Grammatology, the passage to another from the Hegel to the other beginning. Heidegger has his other beginning too, from the German idealists. To understand that there's never been a name in the West other than time. And yet that's the one thing that we've never been able to define. And if we were to start talking about something else, you can no longer use the word time. And I don't feel any of the current guys, quite frankly, in the history of scholarship, has ever pointed that out. Let alone if you tried to go outside the West. Some of us do, not because we're smuggling in the East with the pre-colonial non-West or the indigenous. We just want to get to know them, encounter, understand, share, maybe reciprocate if we can. But that's there, inside this ontotheological constitution of Western metaphysics, which has Judaism prior to Christianity. If you want to say Judeo-Christian, but then that also gets us into all kinds of complications. Nancy gets into this in this phenology of Heidegger after the Black Notebook. I don't want to go down the, ontotheological constitution. I don't mean the religious constitutions of metaphysics. It's what Heidegger meant by, this appearance of the divine built into the upper highest limits for Plato and for Aristotle down to Hegel, as in the being of being itself as something absolutely transcendent beyond human comprehension and language. Not the being of entities, which is the ontological difference, but the other God. Nietzsche, Schelling. This is not the Christian God, that's for sure. They're not even going to reproduce that. Like 2,000 years and not a single new God in the West. How embarrassing, as Nietzsche says. He's referring to Christ, Christianity. The re-divinization of the holy. But the point is that for Derrida, this time is the register that has escaped the entire scholarly undertaking. For them, for both Heidegger in radically different ways, and for Derrida. I'm not going to draw on personal conversations, but it sounds like this is not a project of self-inflation at all, but just if I can take from them, genealogy becomes important. But here Heidegger at some point says it's not even about, he's digging into Hegel a little bit here, but at some point I didn't read it. It's not even about all the different modalities Oh, sorry. I have to make myself on the share here. I found it. So if you can't go with Nietzsche, I'm just looking right here. But such an inquiry of self-ontology taken in the right sense without favoring any particular ontological directions or tendencies requires a further clue. So no predetermined thing, nothing deductive, no a prioris that are laid out in advance, and no intention to, maybe that's the radical suspension, of where you think you're going. Maybe you're going down these paths. But it's this primordiality. Ontological inquiry is indeed more primordial as over against the ontical. No one's doing that. At least Heidegger and Derrida. Of the positive science, but it itself remains it remains itself naive and opaque if it, in its researches into the being of entities, it fails to discuss the meaning of being, the is of the is, the why and the how and the facticity of the is. And if it's totally empty, which some people claim that's what Heidegger ends up saying, nothing, but then nothing is positive. Because you don't want to add a predicate to it. Being is Michael, being is this person, that person. And even the ontological task of constructing, see, there's your Nietzsche, non-deductive genealogy, putting values into question for the first time, questioning the value of values, the unknown territory. That's how he opens up the genealogy of morals. It questions the whole idea of value and meaning and good and evil distinction. All moral systems of different possible ways of being requires that we first come to this is Nietzsche being the last man in position for Heidegger. He's already saying it here. He didn't ask about the meaning of being because he didn't ask about the question. He asked about the will to truth. And his answer becomes the will to power and the eternal return when you take away all of the truths because you deconstructed it genealogically. So you don't end up owning nothing. But he went crazy and he couldn't figure out what he meant by those. That's not what Heidegger says. No dig against Nietzscheans, but maybe it was. Okay. The point being is that what is he saying here? It's not this. It's like, look, this seems foundational for Heidegger anyway, not Derrida. And all of it's blind, as he says later on, if you can't clarify the fundamental task of posing a question of meaning of being. But who's going to do it?
It's a page turner, Raj.
I mean, literally.
Yeah, because the next chapter is on Tazon. So yeah.
I know. Well, okay. Maybe we should stop the reading of Being and Time right here. It's just I feel like we're at the what do they call that? The base camp of Everest. I've never done it. I was in Nepal. You're supposed to fly over to a point to begin the climb. The base camp is where you start to take a little something to get to some point to then start. If you want to try that, I don't have the courage to go all the way up there. And I feel like that's kind of like where we're at. Is like, how do we get this understanding of Heidegger and Derrida in a way that reactivates the original problematic for Derrida? When I say original sense of Derrida at this early moment. Okay, we're coming up at 10:24. I hope I didn't miss out on any of the chats here. I know there have been a lot. Circular Spinozist origin. That's clear. I thought I saw something from Sarga on understanding versus answering a question.
I think Alex asked the very simple question, what is? So if you could quickly answer that for Alex.
But Derrida and Heidegger would say, what is Alex? What do you think?
From a linguistic point of view, I can give you about 20 different meanings.
Yeah, we can't do from the.
Yeah, I'm a little bit struck.
Then it's sort of linguistic ontic.
Like, is a bridge, but does it do anything linguistically? Is it any sort of particle of knowledge or designation by itself? No, it's a mental construct as we mentally orient our own ontology around the idea of asking a question so we can even understand what we're talking about.
Right.
But is it anything itself? No.
By the way, it's a Western priority, not just the ousia, but it's the Western priority for the verb tense to connect everything, which is what Heidegger says earlier on. But I was told this, don't assume this. And maybe Derrida has something to say about the Eurocentric nature of this. Don't assume that for a lot of other languages. The absolute centrality of the verb to be to make the connections between subject and predicate. I don't live in Mandarin Chinese, but maybe think about indigenous spaces of it. So you got to give it, it's taken on too much. Although Judeo and Christian, I am predicates for Christianity, all the predicates that you get in the Gospels, the way, the life, and the truth, the amness before Abraham was I am. But, I come to it, the genius of the Judaic moment in the Exodus. Ehyeh Heshe Ehyeh, and the Yud Vav Vav, I ought to be and to be alive, both to be and to be alive, but also the living one. I am who I am is the classic translation of the final disclosure of the name to Moses. You want me to go free then? Who am I? I can't even tell. Don't worry, I'll be there with you. Okay, I'll go do it. Oh, by the way, what's your name? What's my name? Are you kidding me? Fred? I'm who I am. You're not going to tell me who I am, and I'm going to be who I'm going to be, and I will be over temporality of being. And it's not even reducible to 3 moments of time. That's a brilliant moment. I've never seen anything like that, quite frankly, across traditions. But I don't think Heidegger, that's Heidegger's blindness. He could have maybe picked up, and I know there's work on this, about how do you bring Heidegger into conversation with Judaic traditions of different kinds. A lot of works, which is great. With the ultimate horizon of understanding what the historical moment is for Heidegger and the question of Nazism, of course. But there's a relationality there that's not explored. And Heidegger didn't do. If he would have stayed with the Jesuits training, he would have gotten some Hebrew. Or to quote Descartes, he tried to study it, but it was too hard. And Derrida, I mean, I'm not going to make light of it, but Vichy's, that's the original exclusion and erasure that took place in him, having to go into hiding in the Islamic mass of Algeria during decolonization and Vichy France. So, and by the end, when he gets to Judaities in the first visit to Israel, which was at the end, didn't feel qualified to speak about the issue of being Jewish, which is a torment, but a primordial rupture too. That's the most authentic, if you ask me, thing anyone can say. That then allows him to enter into the space to try to inquire into the depths of the tradition. See, that's a move. Maybe we need to all do that with our own national, religious, racialized ancestries, even down to the individual level. So, Michael, if you can change the wording in your birth certificate, come up with a different name, different date, different place.
I think we're all doing that all the time, are we not?
You counted Northern Virginia. I'm going to close the session with Northern Virginia. Okay, folks, we'll keep moving if it's okay. Session 4. Yeah, it's a 4th session, but it's section 4 being in time, and then chapter 3. And you'll see that these sections are going to get longer, so we'll have to figure out how to maybe take a piece of either each the chapter and Derrida, but certainly the sections in Heidegger are going to get longer, so we're not going to be able to cover all of it. We may have to just take like a portion, the beginning portions of a section. Okay, thank you very much.
Hey, I have a plug. I have a plug for a friend, Nick Warren at Penn State. He's speaking on Derrida and Heidegger and the Thing. And if you're interested, let me know. I'll forward you the details.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, Michael, if you want to send it to me, and I'll find a way to circulate, but also post it on the Hegel Heidegger Derrida Facebook group.
Okay, great.
Okay. All right. We'll see everybody in 2 weeks. Thank you so much for being here in the discussion.
Thank
Take care,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.